reading and writing came as I always had a fascination with beer, with books. And the first poet I got into was Shel Silverstein. As a kid, I thought he was amazing. And so I would write little poems and stuff like that. And then I read this, it was like an essay about Martin Luther King Jr. So I bought a book about him, and I thought it was powerful. You know, even though I was very young, I thought what his message of, being and all that was very powerful. So I saw him at that age as an influence. And then I got into Stephen King when I was 9. The first book I read was Cujo. And then I read Pet Sematary, and then It. By the time I was 10 years old, I was already reading adult novels and stuff like that. And it just went on from there, from then music, and then getting into the American writers and the beats and stuff like that. But I was very fortunate because I used to read newspapers all the time as a kid. I kind of taught myself how to read. So, but there was something about Shel. I remember it, how much his poems were so simple but so fascinating, and the artwork as well. And then reading that essay on Dr. Martin Luther King it's still in my head. I was only 6, I think. I'm 36 now, so it had an impact. I don't remember what the essay was. I just remember owning it and reading it. And then Stephen King somehow came to my life. I think when you're those introverted young kids and you're into horror films and comic books, there's somehow Stephen King kind of becomes a part of that, And so yeah, those were my early influences. And not only that, but comic books, whatever Stan Lee wrote. Even articles from Playboy, for example, were interesting to read as a child. Which is, you'd rather look at the women, and which I did, but you have those articles in there that are pretty good. And but yeah, those were my early influences as a writer, as a young age at least. So.
Yeah, and I guess, would you describe your writing as prose? Because I read it, and I guess that was more the style I would say, or more, certainly more direct, I guess is what I say. Not a lot of metaphors, but more just describing your experiences and kind of short passages. That's what at least I've seen of your writing.
Right. It's definitely direct. You could call it prose. I wouldn't even know how to explain it, because I remember when I didn't really get into poetry or really take into it until my late 20s, when I used to bartend. I used to bartend in the West Village, and it was Monday. No one ever drinks, but apparently I'm a good storyteller. So there was this woman used to come in every Monday, and we would talk, and I would tell her all stories about my life, and she was like, you should write these down. They're pretty interesting. And she was not the first person to do that. And then once I met someone from France who, after meeting her, just really inspired me. It's you know what, I'm going to do this. I'm going to take this very seriously. Because in my mid 20s to my late 20s, I would have something in my head that I liked, and I would write it down and just put it in a shelf or something like that. And then when I was, how old was I? 24, I saw Teenage Jesus and the Jerks at the Knitting Factory, which is I love that. I love Lydia Lunch. She's a huge inspiration for me as a writer. So after seeing that, me and the friends I had at the time were like, let's start a no-wave band. So I started writing all these shitty, kind of crappy songs. But then I saved some of what I thought sounded good. And then when I got older, I just said, fuck it. This is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to express myself. And it was also a great way to it's therapeutic, because, at the time, not everyone's 100% mentally. So when you can write down how you're feeling instead of talking to someone about it, I think that's a little better way. So I wouldn't really know how. I guess you could say it's direct. I guess you could. I mean, it's modern. there's a lot of New York in it. You know, New York is definitely an inspiration. There's a lot of mental health in it. There's a lot of, you know, like substance abuse in it, but there's also love in it. There's reality in it, and that's not, I wouldn't know how to describe it, really.
So what has been like some of your most meaningful pieces, or ones that you've written that have like really stuck with you?
Oh, I think that the one poem I wrote, there's a couple that's really stuck to me. They're the ones I perform when I recite, which, you know, unfortunately. There's a poem I wrote called Bellevue Blues, and it was about my experience there, and that's always been kind of like an inspiration.
And just to clarify for the listeners, when you say Bellevue, you're referring to Bellevue Hospital in New York, right? The famous public hospital that's one of the oldest public hospitals and has been used in literature and TV. And a lot of people go there for mental health services.
Right. And the poem is just talking about someone who's, you know, you think you're crazy, but then you see people that are far more psychotic than you are. But you feel for them, but you also feel that you are one of them. You know, you feel that sense of insanity and that mental state you were in. But when I wrote that poem, I performed it. I think it was 2013 at there's this bar called Old Man Hustle. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I haven't heard of it.
It's in the Lower East Side. It's a very small bar, and it's a comedy bar now. But they have a little stage, and they had an open mic thing. And Reverend Jen was having, I think it was her birthday party or something. So what she used to do was she would do anti-slams, which there's a lot of slam poetry, which I personally don't like slam poetry. I think poetry should be heard, not scored. So she had this anti-slam, and a friend of mine asked if I wanted to do a poem for it. And it was last minute, and I didn't know what poem to write. And I was like, oh, I just wrote a poem called Bellevue Blues. You know, wrote it down, and, you know, didn't have time to memorize it. So I go to this Old Man Hustle, and it's packed with all these writers and artists and, you know, who've been around for years. So when I went up and did the poem, I didn't know how to do it. I didn't want to just recite it like a poet, like a typical poet. So I would sing the verse in between and snap my fingers, and that caught people's attention. And every time I recite that poem, it gets people's attention. And so that one definitely is up there for me as the top one of the poem, not only that I recite, but the one people always tell me about. And then there's one called Ink Stains. And Ink Stains is I wrote that. There was a period between 2013 and 15 where I just wrote every single day. And I would write at bars, of course. Just write on cocktail napkins. If I had a journal, I'd write on the journal, you know. Go home wasted, you'd wake up, you had no idea what happened, what you wrote, but I would always find these little cocktail napkins of poems I'd write, or these long pages from paper towel rolls or whatever. So there was a long, like those years where I was just writing nonstop, where I wrote most of the poetry books are written. But Ink Stains was one of a big one for me, because it was like, I think the last time we had a bad snow year, in like 2014, and you know, I live in a little studio. There's no good lighting. You know, the winter can be tough for people. You know, you get seasonal depression. And I wrote Ink Stains. It was the verse, the introduction. The verse is, I have 2 tabs open. Forgot to eat. The studio has no lightings, and it smells like cigarettes, but I don't smoke. You know, and that's pretty much a poem about alcohol and depression.
So you have kind of a seasonal thing. Then I guess when you talk about like if it rains or so the weather kind of affects like how you feel.
I guess you could say that. I mean, that because it was really cold, you know, so like, and it lasted so long. But like that struck a chord with me because I noticed that was my habit was I'm going to this bar and then I'm going to keep my tab open. I'm going to another bar and I'm going to keep my tab open. I'm going to go home and sleep it out and do the same thing, but it's fucking cold out. And, you know, I just wrote about that experience and that, you know, and how kind of mentally unhealthy it was. But when I wrote that got a lot of people like, you know, enjoyed it. And then there was a Nowhere Else to Go, which is about New York, how much I love New York, but I feel like there's nowhere else for me to go, you know. And when that one started, the intro to that is like, New York, I have nowhere else to go. Like, New York, I have nowhere else to be a working stiff and a late night drinker. You know, do you remember that one time New York when I died in Brooklyn? You know, it's just, you know, or New York, we are survivors. You know, and that mentality of surviving, especially in a city like this, especially in times like this. You know,
yeah,
something like that could be very inspirational. I mean, I get judged a lot too. Don't get me wrong. I mean, every artist is going to have some sort of negative kind of